Hi everyone, welcome to a very quick discussion related to the history of Carnival and how it might serve as a case against reparations, not only in the Caribbean, not only in South America, but also in North America. We're going to use the Jamaica name history also as an example of what might be getting in the way of entire Caribbean nations, entire nations in the West receiving reparations. Now, before we address the correlation between reparations and Carnival, we're just going to quickly look at this brief history of Jamaica. It indicates that the original inhabitants of Jamaica were believed to have been the Arawaks, also called Taino. It's indicated that they came from South America 2,500 years ago. It's unclear how they know this. And then they named the island not Jamaica, but Xaymaca, which, according to the narrative, meant the land of wood and water. The Arawaks were described as a mild and simple people by nature. Physically, they were described as being light brown in color, short, well-shaped, with coarse black hair, and their faces were described as broad and with flat noses. Additionally, it's indicating that the Arawaks led very quiet and peaceful lives until they were destroyed by the Spaniards subsequent to Christopher Columbus discovering the island in 1494. Now we have a question here. The allegation or assertion is that the Arawaks were there, that the Taino, they were there, and there was a colonization dynamic, and the Spaniards destroyed the Arawaks. Now, of course, there are indications that the Arawaks or the Taino are still in Jamaica. The question, however, is what happened to all of these Spaniards that participated in the destruction and the colonization? The answer is they didn't go anywhere. The same Europeans that colonized Jamaica and these other islands are still in these other islands and Jamaica. And this, of course, ties to this issue of reparations that we're going to examine. And so you see these depictions of Carnival on the screen. When individuals see these depictions, there is a tendency to attribute this dynamic to South America, to the indigenous people of the Americas. However, this particular tradition is rooted in Europe. And so you see this rooting in Spain. You see this dynamic related to Lent in France. And so this is not a dynamic that is indigenous or originating in the Americas. It originated in Europe and was transplanted into the Americas. Hence the time frame for Carnival generally. You see Carnival in New Orleans, you see Carnival in the Caribbean, and so you see all of these people participating in this Carnival. And many people don't take the time to step back and say, well, what is the origin of this? How did it get here? And what is this systematic practicing of this thing known as Carnival? And so while there is this narrative that this name Jamaica is rooted in an indigenous rendering of this name with the Xaymaca, what you see here is that this name, in terms of the etymology, is rooted in Iberia. And so this name appears to be a transplant from Iberia into the Americas, consistent with the entities that actually colonized that space. And so you see this Spanish influence in terms of this name. And so this is not an indigenous name. This appears to be a name that has European roots, specifically Iberia, again, consistent with the individuals who colonized the space and also consistent with the colonizers that took over many spaces in the Americas. And so if you start to trace a number of these names that have been asserted as indigenous names, you will likely find that these names are actually tied to the language and the history of the actual colonizers. The colonizers, by and large, gave these names to these spaces. That's why you have places like New Zealand and New Ireland, New York even. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go forward with this quick examination. I just want you to quickly see this translation so you can see it for yourself. You look over and you see it's detected as Galician with the Xamaica, and when you see it in the English, it's Jamaica. And here you can see the nuance up close with respect to that translation from the Galician into the English. Even in the Scots Gaelic, you see this acceptance of this particular spelling, this transliteration of Jamaica coming out of the Galician. You also see an acceptance of this going into the Yoruba from the Galician. Now, this is something to pay attention to here. Even though you have Galicia related to Spain, you also have Galicia related to Ukraine. Now, if you think back, you also have a history of the Igbo and the Yoruba and other groups on the west coast of Africa having some sort of relationship with the Eurasian area. You also have a history in Jamaica of an understanding of being related to some of the people on the west coast of Africa who are tied to these Eurasian types of roots, specifically the Igbo. And so just keep that in mind. Galicia is about Spain, and Galicia is also about Ukraine. Now the question is, what does Carnival have to do with reparations, whether people receive it or they do not? With respect to the Caribbean in particular, the islands, Carnival signals a cultural inheritance, and that cultural inheritance is not clearly and unilaterally one that is rooted in Africa or the transatlantic slave trade. That practice of Carnival comes straight out of Europe. Some people believe that it comes from the indigenous people of the Americas, but when you look at the totality of Carnival, including the context, when does Carnival take place? Where does Carnival take place? And what you will see when you ask those questions is that Carnival is related to a religious practice. It's related to Catholicism. It's related to Mardi Gras, as it's called in some places, so Fat Tuesday and Wednesday for Lent. And so this is not an indigenous dynamic. This is not an African dynamic. This is a European dynamic, and you see it proliferated throughout the Americas, primarily in South America. You see it throughout the islands, and of course you see it in specific places in the United States. And so what it's also doing is it serves as a reminder that the colonizers never left. So you had these Spaniards who colonized these islands. You had French colonizing. You had Portuguese colonizing. Ultimately, you had some Scots and Irish and British colonizing. You had some other colonizers also, but this Carnival dynamic speaks to a Spanish presence. It speaks to an Iberian presence that remains in the prior colonized spaces known as the Americas. And so what it also does is it brings up the issue of the actual identity of the people on the islands and in certain parts of mainland America. And so for those who would be putting forth these wholesale claims for reparations, those individuals in high places running things, they know very well that collectively they are not entitled to reparations, because what you have going on is a historical and ancestral nuance with respect to a large portion of these populations that precludes them being entitled to these wholesale reparations. Because what you also have, since the colonizers never left, and you look in the Caribbean, you look in certain parts of the Americas, and you see all brown faces. What this means is that many of those brown faces are they are claimants, they are potential claimants, but they are also likely the descendants of the former plantation owners, masquerading, pun intended, as descendants of enslaved or indigenous people. Now, of course, many people are not clear that they are masquerading as descendants of enslaved or indigenous people, but that doesn't take away from the fact that that actually is going on in many cases, and it's definitely going on in the Caribbean, because that's what you have in the Caribbean are brown faces. And so these brown faces, by and large, are related to the people who served as the colonizers who never left. And so what you have, if you make the claim for reparations, is wholesale reparations. So if you have an entire country that requests reparations based upon slavery, you have a problem of what's known as unclean hands. And so you have individuals who are descended from the perpetrators of slavery and colonization making a demand to be reimbursed for slavery that their ancestors did not endure. And you also have a dynamic when you're talking about the Caribbean and places where there is a predominance of brown faces. You don't even have an apartheid history, a significant apartheid history, to even justify a civil rights, a sort of a standard civil rights reparations claim. And so what you have in many instances are the descendants of European, black, and white nobility entertaining this reparations demand when they would actually be precluded from receiving such. They are not entitled to such. And so those in Europe, those in high places in Europe, they also recognize this. And so this is a part of the reason why you don't see these claims being readily advanced. You hear people talk about them, but you do not see this wholesale reparations the way that you would expect to see it. This brings us to Africa. The same dynamic is going on in Africa. Many people see faces in Africa and they just automatically assume these people are indigenous to Africa. But in many instances, what you are seeing in Africa also are individuals who came from other places. They are not indigenous to Africa. You see places where there was colonization, but many of the nobles and the monarchs in Africa actually are European. And so you have a heavy concentration of Europeans on the west coast of Africa. Again, Europe is aware of this. And so therefore, there is not the forthcoming of reparations because the people at the top who are demanding these reparations for their people, by and large, they have European ancestry, regardless of what they look like. And so this dynamic that's in the background serves to preclude a viable wholesale claim for reparations for many groups of people, whether we're talking about in the Americas, whether we're talking about in Africa, and some other places where you see these colonizers that spread out and never left. They went native and now they look like the people that were colonized. Now we're going to wrap this up with a correlation, and that correlation is between reparations and the demand for critical race theory. The same thing applies with respect to critical race theory. You may have individuals who share a particular phenotype. That, however, does not translate into a shared ancestral history or a shared present history. race alone cannot be the determining factor for reparations or for these justice claims with respect to critical race theory. There's more to the issue than simple phenotype. You have different ethnicities, you have different socioeconomic dynamics, you have different political dynamics, you have different national status dynamics. And so you're not always talking about the same people, even though the people may be located in the same place, the people may look very similar, the people may have similar backgrounds in terms of general culture, but you still may not be talking about the same people in terms of these justice claims, whether you're talking about critical race theory types of justice claims or whether you're talking about reparations and justice claims. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.